slave, $1,000 runaway slaves. So I couldn't trust. So all of a sudden, I would bow down, and when I bowed down, there was a man that came up to me, and he was a lawyer, black man, well-to-do black man, and he came up to me and he shook my hand, and he took me home with him. And when he took me home with him, he allowed me to stay, he gave me another suit of clothes, and we changed my name from Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey to Frederick Johnson. But that name would not last long because there was a lot of Johnsons. And I'm sure you done had some Johnsons come across your path in your lifetime. Okay, so I said, no, I didn't want to be a Johnson, but ma'am, I wore it for a little bit. But on that third day when I came downstairs, there was somebody sitting downstairs awaiting me. Anybody want to take a chance at who that was sitting there waiting on me? And he had sent for this person too. Anybody want to take a chance? Who do you think was sitting downstairs waiting on me? That he had sent for? Who? Anna! And quite naturally, man, when I ran down them steps and I saw Anna there, we hugged and we kissed and we were so happy. And before it was all said and done, Mr. Rucker was also a pastor. So you know what he did? You can now kiss the bride. And he said, go north, go north, you're still in a slave state. So we got on the train and we went to New Bedford. And when we got up to New Bedford, I was still amazed at how they were living nice big homes and carriages. They were like rich people up there. And I would go to the anti-slavery meetings. As a matter of fact, this one particular day, I was at the meeting. I was working 3 jobs to support Anna and myself and our springing up family. Well, this particular night, I went to the anti-slavery meeting. I'm sitting there, listening, minding my business, and a gentleman walked by, and he just happened to look, and he said, Frederick! You're Frederick! I'm like, no, I'm not Frederick. No, you're Frederick! I was scared because I didn't know who that man was. That could have been my ticket back to slavery. So he came over and he introduced himself, and he was a black gentleman too. And he told me who he was, and he said, come Frederick, I want to introduce you to someone. So I get up and I follow him. We go to the back room. Well, who was back there waiting to greet me? No other than Mr. William Lloyd Garrison. Yes. And he held out his hand and he shook his hand. We shook hands. And he says, Mr. Frederick, I heard a lot about you. And I said, me, sir? He says, yes. And believe it or not, he pulls out one of his newspapers, The Liberator, and he starts flipping through the pages, and he says, look, that's you. I said, oh, would you believe Mr. Garrison had wrote about me in his newspaper? And he had me to go up and speak. About this time, I'm a young 20, 21-year-old gentleman. So I goes up, well, first I told him, I said, sir, I don't know if I can speak. I don't have any education. The only education I got is slave education. He said, I trust that you can speak. So I went up to the podium and I started speaking. Scared, nervous, you know it, shaking. And I spoke for maybe about a whole hour. And when it was all said and done, everybody was just sitting there looking in awe. And Mr. Garrison got up to the podium. He said, did you just get finished listening to a thing? Or did you just finish listening to a man? And everybody in the audience said, a man. And all of a sudden they thought about it, and they said, you know, they gave me a round of applause, a standing ovation. And at that point, Mr. Garrison had hired me to go on a 6-month speaking tour. And guess what he was paying me a week? $25. Not, somebody thought I was going to say 25 cents. $25 he paid me a week to go speak, and we covered the whole southern tier, northern tier, and we did it for 6 months. And I wound up moving my family to Rochester, New York. And believe it or not, when I moved my family to Rochester, New York, come 1845, I wrote my first book, The Narrative and Life of Frederick Douglass. And would you know, nobody believed that I wrote that book. They said a white man wrote it and just put my face on the front cover. Well, that book, after its production, was printed in sold 5,000 copies. Printed in 5 different languages. And one Saturday morning, this would be a perfect time to take a break. One Saturday morning at my home in Rochester on 1st Street, my family and I was having breakfast. That tastes good. Well, in comes through the door no other than Mr. William Lloyd Garrison, screaming and shouting, "Frederick, Frederick, you must leave! You must leave! You told on your masters! They're going to come get you!" And I'm like, "Mr. Garrison, I can't leave. You must leave, or else they're going to come get you." And my beautiful wife, Anna, sitting here with our baby girl, Anna, she says, "Frederick, go. I want you alive. We need you alive, not dead. Go." And I said, "But Anna, what about the family? Don't worry about the family. You go." Well, that's what I did. I went. And I wound up going to Ireland. And when I got to Ireland, they had the Irish Potato Festival going on. And I stayed there for 2 years. And then I returned. As I stated earlier, one reason I returned because my baby girl Anna, who was 10 years old, had died. So that's one of the main reasons that I came back. And when I came back, as I stated, we were living in Rochester, New York, and I had began my papers, the North Star, the Frederick Douglass Weekly, and various others. And my oldest girl, Rosetta, and my oldest son, Louis, they were helping me with these newspapers. Well, by this time, maybe about 1859, the elections were coming up. And there were 3 young men that was running for president of these United States. The first young man, well, let me back up. I told you my last name was Johnson. By this time, we were in New Bedford, and a friend of mine had went to see a play. And in this play, the play was A Lady on the Lake. And there was a gentleman in the play with the last name of Douglas. His was 1 S. So, you know what I did? I said, I like that name. I'll take that name, but the difference is I'll add another S. So when you say my last name, you don't say Douglas. You say Douglas. You sound off with the S's. Douglas. So, like I was saying, there were 3 gentlemen vying for president of these United States. The first gentleman, I'll say his name because it's very familiar to mine, Douglas. At first I was going to go for him until I read about his platform, what he stood for. Mr. Douglas, believe it or not, he wasn't against and he wasn't for. He wasn't against and he was for slavery. So that wiped him out immediately. The second gentleman, I believe his name is Richardson, I might be a little off on that. He really didn't want slavery to end. And then there was that third gentleman. I don't know if anybody in here ever heard of this third gentleman. Little old man from Illinois. I believe his name was Abraham Lincoln. Now, Abraham Lincoln was married to a beautiful young lady by the name of Mary Lincoln. And the true story is that Mary Lincoln, she had slaves. And she didn't want to give up her slaves. The true story is that Abraham Lincoln, being the husband of Mary, was involved in this slavery situation. However, he had a mindset that slavery should come to an end one day. And on that premises, that got him elected. Now, believe it or not, a lot of the Confederates in the South, they were upset. And when I say Confederates, I'm talking Democrats. They were upset. In case you didn't know this, before Abraham Lincoln put his hat in the ring for president of the United States, there was no Republican Party. The Republican Party was born as soon as Abraham Lincoln put his hat in to run for president. That was the beginning of the Republican Party. I just thought I would share that little bit of history with you. Now, myself, I was a Republican too. Mainly because of my good friend, Abraham Lincoln. Once Abraham Lincoln became president of these United States, I was kind of confused. And I wrote about Abraham Lincoln. And I wrote an article saying that Abraham Lincoln was slothful. Abraham Lincoln didn't care about black people in this country. Abraham Lincoln ought to be ashamed of himself. Well, I wound up taking a trip from Rochester, New York to Washington, D.C. And I wound up going to the White House. Yes, I, a black man, became the first black man to enter into the White House. No, I was not the first president. I think, what's his name? What's that man's name? Yes, I think he was the first black man. But to any avail, when I got to the White House, we had to fill out a little card of why we were there to see the president. So I filled out the card, and I had 3 reasons that I was there to fill out to see the president. And I had to turn that in. And it went forth to a gentleman by the name of Mr. Stanton. Mr. Stanton went forth, and he put it on Mr. Abraham Lincoln's desk. Well, while I'm down touring around, I hear this. Mr. Douglas! Mr. Douglas! Mr. Douglas! And all of a sudden, I started making my way up the stairwell. By the time I got maybe up to the top stair, there were some white guys that were downstairs, and I heard somebody say, boy, I can't believe it, they let Negroes in the White House. Now, as you know, ma'am, me and Mr. Corvée, oh, they wouldn't fight like that back then. Mr. Corvée and I, we had a battle. But then I had to think, am I here to fight, or am I here to fight about issues? So the issues won out over me going back downstairs and getting into a fight, because I would have lost anyway. So, I go in, and when I walk in, the president, Mr. Abraham Lincoln, he was sitting in a chair such as, in his chair, all sprawled out with his long legs and what have you. And I went to say something, he says, oh, Mr. Douglas. So he stood up, and as he stood up, I went from here, and I thought to myself, wow, he's tall. So I put my hand out to shake, and when I went to say something, I started baffling because I was nervous. And he stopped me, and he says, Mr. Douglas, it's okay. I know who you are. I said, thank you, sir. And he says, I heard about you talking about me. You said I was slothful. You said I was dragging my feet. Well, let me tell you while I was slothful and dragging my feet. If I had moved in such a quick motion, there would have been more death and destruction than you've ever seen in your life. So he invited me to have a seat. And he asked me, he said, Mr. Douglas, what can I do for you today? Well, I have you know in a sophisticated way, I cross my legs, and I begin to chatter. Mr. Lincoln, I come here today, well, first of all, thank you, Mr. Lincoln, for seeing me. I come here today, sir, of matter of 3 important issues on my mind. The first, sir, I am concerned about the black man and the black race being free in this country. The second reason I come, sir, is the fact that I am concerned. We are on the heels of the Civil War. And even though black men are in the service, they are not serving in the service. Meaning what, Mr. Douglas? Meaning that, sir, right now, currently, the black man serves in the service. However, he is working in your kitchens. He is tending to housekeeping. He is building your buildings. Sir, we need to go a little deeper. We need to put a weapon in his hands and let him go to the front line and fight. Because what I saw at the beginning of the Civil War, to me, was the door opening to black men going in and fighting, and then coming out the other end free. That's what I saw. And then, sir, the last of my 3 issues is women. Women of all colors being free. Sir, I'm a big proponent of women's rights. And I believe that women in this country should be free to vote. And I believe there's other reasons that women in this country should be free, no matter the color of the race. So after that, I stood up. In short, I faced him, and I said, sir, thank you very much for your time. I reached out my hand, and we shook hands. And as we shook hands, I made my way to the exit. And when I got to the exit, ladies and gentlemen, outside of the main fence. I turned around and I looked at the White House with my chest out, and I folded my hands and I said, the White House. I can't believe it. I was the first black to be in there. I felt big, I said to myself. So I made it on back to Rochester, and believe it or not, we were all gathered under the stars. It was a cold, brisk night, and the sun, the moon, if you will, was shining bright. And we were all out there. Must have been hundreds of us out there. And out of nowhere, here it comes. The Pony Express, it comes. And a gentleman jumps off the horse, Hildy, and he takes out a piece of paper, and he ravels it down, and he starts to read the contents of this paper. He says, January 1, 1863, by law, I bring to you, signed by the President, by the 16th President of these United States, the Emancipation Proclamation, stating that all black people in this country are forever free. And when he read that, he rolled it up and he got on his horse and he left. And you know, he left us in jubilation. He left us in tears. He left us in happiness. We spent the whole night just joyful, happy, and just thanking God that what? We were free. We moved from the outside and we moved to the church. The church was filled to the rafters. And by dawn of the next day, we were still out there having a great time. Because, ladies and gentlemen, we were free. Well, I got called to the White House just to move fast because I don't have my timepiece. So anybody can entertain me on the time?
7:40.
7:40? Are y'all still sitting here? All right. Well, guess what, ladies and gentlemen? We'll be here till tomorrow morning because I'm going to keep going. So anyway, she's looking like, baby. I got to go home. I don't know about you, baby. So just to kind of wrap it up and speed it up a little bit, 1864, I was called, believe it or not, President Lincoln had called me back to the White House. He had called me back to the White House because of the fact that he felt that something was about to happen. Now keep in mind, this is after the second inauguration, after he got reelected. He felt something was going to happen to him. He felt something was going to happen by the Democrats. So he paid my way back to the White House, and when I got to the White House, we were sitting in the Oval Office, and he said, Mr. Douglas, I would like for you, I commission you, if you will, to go out, and I need you to round up all the blacks who are not aware that they have been freed. And I need you to move them north. Will you do this? And sir, it just left me in awe because I was surprised that he would choose me after what I said about his slothfulness. Well, I left and I did that. And that's when what is known today, and I don't know if you know about it, it's called Juneteenth. January the 19th, 1865, that's when the word went out that the rest of the slaves were forever free. Moving on, I became the first, let me say this. My good friend Abraham Lincoln was at the Ford Theater. Him and his beautiful wife Mary were at the theater in their suite, and looking at the play, a gentleman snuck in from the rear, and that gentleman, as the story goes, shot Mr. Lincoln in the back of the head, right here. I believe that was April the 15th, I could be a little off on the date, of 1865. 3 days later, they buried my friend. Vice President Andrew Johnson became president, and I'll have you know, that vice president who became president was no friend of the black people. If it was left up to him, he would have reversed everything and put us all back into slavery. I recall that they had a memorial that they built for Abraham Lincoln, the Lincoln Memorial, which still stands to this day in Washington, D.C. There were a lot of people gathered at the memorial in the park, and there was a lawyer that was up speaking. And a gentleman saw me standing. He said, "Let's go, Frederick! 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 Please! We beg you to get up and say a few words." Well, I had nothing prepared. However, I got up and I spoke. And I said, "This president, Abraham Lincoln, he was no friend of the black people in this country. Abraham Lincoln, he was your president. You were his children. We were the stepchildren. We were his foster children. Though we were his foster children, President Abraham Lincoln was a man of his word. And the man of the word that he was is when he signed that Emancipation Proclamation, freeing all blacks in this country. That's why we're here, to pay tribute to one of the greatest presidents of these United States. Thank you!" And everybody stand up and gave me a standing ovation. Moving on from there, I became the first black president of the Freeman National Bank. Moving on from there, I became Marshal of Washington, D.C., the first black Marshal of Washington, D.C. As a matter of fact, I escorted President Ulysses S. Grant. I escorted him on many of his travels. And also, as Marshal, I got the opportunity to go back and visit my ex-slave master, Hugh Ard. By this time, Master Ard was sick and on his deathbed. And when I walked in to see him at his home, I sat by the bed, and I even held his hand. And he said, "Marshal." And I said, "Mr. Hugh, don't call me Marshal. Call me what you used to call me back in the days. Call me Frederick." And that's what he did. And I called him like I called him back in the days, except I moved the master out the way and I just called him Mr. Hugh. Well, we talked and he mentioned to me, he said, "Frederick, I will be honest with you. I was 100% against slavery. That's why I gave you as what I gave you. Because I was hoping that you would run and be free. And on your grandmother, Miss Betty Bailey, I apologize deeply for what they did to her. I apologize. I was 100% against that as well. But I see, Mr. Douglas, you have, don't call me Mr. Douglas, call me Frederick. I see, Frederick, that you have done good for your life, and I see that you have done good for many others in your life. I am very happy for you, sir." At that point, I grabbed his hand and I held it tight and I said a little prayer for him. And I left. 3 weeks later, it was reported that he had died. Moving on, I became the Orders of Deed. I got a commission that sent me to Haiti for 2 years, which after 2 years, I walked away from. My wife in 1884, 1882, Anna, she passed away. It took a lot out of me. And if it wasn't for the likes of Harriet Tubman and Ida B. Well, who came to my aid to help me, who knows what would have happened. I might have died. To further that, at the age of 66, 2 years later, I got remarried. I got remarried to my secretary, Miss Helen Pitts. Miss Helen Pitts was a white lady. And believe me, when we got married, my daughter, Rosetta, she tongue lashed me all over that building. As a matter of fact, they disowned me. Helen Pitts' family disowned her as well. So we traveled. And when we came back, on my last day of life, which is tomorrow, I told Helen that I had to go to a speaking engagement. So I got in the carriage. I thought I brought my cane with me. So I got in the carriage, and it took me off to the Washington Convention Center. Oh! That's not me guiding the horses. I'm in the carriage. The door opened, and I'm helped out the carriage. by no other than, and some of you all probably got some of the coins. Anybody have an idea? Some of you all might have the coins. They don't make them anymore. I got 5 of them. It was a young lady who helped me. Anybody want to take a guess?
Oh.
Susan B. Anthony, yes. So she helped me out. I walked in the convention center. She helped me up to the stage where I took my seat until it was time, and she sat right next to me until it was time for me to go up and speak. I went up and spoke, and afterwards she helped me back to my carriage. And I will let you know that in Rochester, New York, Susan B. Anthony, she lived maybe 2 blocks away from me. In Rochester, New York, to this day, my home is a memorial site. Her home is a memorial site, and they have a bust of me there, I believe, in City Hall. I'll conclude in a minute. So I get back in the carriage, and I'm going back home. That's not me guiding horses. I'm sitting inside. So when I get home, the driver, he comes, he opens up the door, and he kindly helped me out like a young gentleman he was. And I make it on up to my door, and I go inside, and Helen is entertaining guests in the kitchen. And she says, "Frederick, are you hungry? Would you like some tea?" I said, "No, Helen, I'm going to go upstairs and relax because I have another engagement." Well, as I go to step on the first step, I jerked. And Helen blurs out, "Now, Frederick, stop playing." Because believe it or not, outside of public, I was a very witty guy. In public, I was a very stern guy. Well, she said, "Stop playing." Well, I went to take the second step, and that's when I had a major heart attack. And that's where I died, at the foot of my step, at the foot of the stairwell in my home in Anacostia, Washington, D.C. I had bought a mansion. The mansion overlooked, and it was a straight shot. As you stand there, you can see the Washington Monument, you can see the Capitol, and then you can see the White House. Everything was straight in line once you walk out my front door. Well, they laid me in state for exactly a week. Great people like Prince, kings, queens, presidents, you name it, Susan B. Anthony, they all came to say goodbye to me. I am currently buried in Rochester, New York, next to my wife, Anna, and Helen, she's buried there too. She's like maybe one section behind me. And I owe a lot to Helen because of the fact that after I died, she raised money to hold on to Cedar Hill, my home. And once she got too ill to maintain it, she turned it over to the Parks Department, and that's who owns it now. Recreation, Washington, D.C.'s Recreation Center owns my home now. And every 5 years or 10 years, they'll paint it, or as you know, homes, over years it starts to decay, so they go in and do restoration. And I will also mention that it was stated last year, 2018, or maybe 2017, that in the northern public schools, they are going to institute, I think next year, 2020, school year, they will they will begin a new curriculum entitled Frederick Douglass. Yeah, so they'll be teaching Frederick Douglass to the northern schools. Who knows if it's going to make it down south. But Frederick Douglass, he lives forever. And also, his first book, The Narrative and Life of Frederick Douglass, they are reissuing that book as well. And it will also be issued as part of the curriculum in the public schools. And you can also purchase the reissued copies of the book, Narrative and Life of Frederick Douglass. Now, he also wrote 3 books. After The Narrative and Life of Frederick Douglass, he wrote My Bondage and My Freedom, which was number 2. And his last book was Life and Times of Frederick Douglass. And Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, basically, you would find the writings of the narrative, the bondage, and what happened after the bondage. So 3 books, his whole life. And with that, I come to an end. I know you all want to stay till tomorrow morning, but I come to an end.